When people talk about Mark Zuckerberg, they usually compress the story into something almost accidental. A student, a dorm room, a good idea at the right time. It's a narrative that makes success feel approachable, almost random. But the reality is far more calculated and far less comfortable. Because what Zuckerberg built was never about creating something popular. It was about understanding how people behave, and then designing a system around that behavior so precisely that it becomes unavoidable. At Harvard University, Zuckerberg wasn't operating like most students. He wasn't optimizing for status, social recognition, or even traditional achievement. He was observing patterns, not casually, but systematically. How do people choose who to connect with? What makes them engage? What triggers a reaction? Most people participate in social environments without thinking about the underlying mechanics. Zuckerberg treated those environments like data, something to be analyzed, broken down, and reconstructed. This is what led to early projects like FaceMash. On the surface, it looked trivial, comparing faces, voting, simple interaction. But the speed at which it spread revealed something deeper. People are naturally drawn to systems that allow them to express judgment, comparison, and identity. It wasn't about the product itself, it was about the behavioral loop it created. Input, reaction, feedback, repetition. Once that loop is established, engagement becomes automatic. That insight became the foundation of Facebook. When it launched, it didn't look revolutionary. Profiles, friend lists, basic interactions, nothing technically extraordinary. But Zuckerberg wasn't focused on innovation in the traditional sense. He was focused on integration. Every feature was designed to increase dependency. The more you used it, the more of your identity became tied to it. Photos weren't just images, they were memories stored in a system. Messages weren't just conversations, they were records of relationships. Over time, Facebook stopped being a tool and became an extension of personal existence. This is where the real shift happens, when a platform transitions into infrastructure. Most companies exist alongside your life. Infrastructure becomes part of how your life functions. And once something reaches that level, competition becomes irrelevant. You're no longer choosing whether to use it. You're operating within it. Zuckerberg understood this early, and every major decision reflects that understanding. As the company grew, internal conflicts emerged, particularly with Eduardo Saverin. From a surface-level perspective, these conflicts are framed emotionally: betrayal, disagreement, personal fallout. But if you analyze them structurally, they represent something else: the elimination of misalignment. Systems at scale cannot tolerate ambiguity and control. They require clarity, direction, authority. Zuckerberg consistently prioritized those factors, even when it came at a personal cost. As Facebook expanded, it began to absorb more than just users. It absorbed attention, time, focus, and eventually, influence. Information started to flow through the platform in ways that extended far beyond social interaction. News distribution, political messaging, cultural trends, all became part of the same system. At that point, Facebook was no longer just reflecting reality, it was shaping it. This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable, because influence at that scale creates a new type of responsibility, one that traditional business frameworks aren't designed to handle. Privacy concerns, data misuse, public backlash, these weren't isolated issues. They were the natural consequence of a system that had grown beyond its original scope. Most companies would fracture under that level of pressure, but Facebook didn't, because it had already embedded itself too deeply into user behavior. Habits are more powerful than opinions. People may criticize a platform, but if their daily routines depend on it, they don't leave. Zuckerberg understood this distinction. He didn't try to win public approval in the traditional sense. Instead, he continued to reinforce the system, strengthen its position, expand its reach. This is where acquisitions like Instagram and WhatsApp become critical. They weren't just business deals, they were structural reinforcements. Each acquisition removed a potential competitor while simultaneously expanding the system's control over different forms of communication. Visual content, private messaging, social identity, all brought under one umbrella. Not through domination, but through integration. Over time, this created a network so extensive that it became difficult to define where it began and where it ended. Users didn't experience it as a single platform. They experienced it as part of everyday life. And that's the highest level of system design, when the system disappears into the background, but its influence remains constant. However, systems at that scale introduce a new challenge: stagnation. Once something dominates completely, growth becomes harder to define. You can't simply add more users indefinitely. You can't scale infinitely within the same framework. At that point, the only option is transformation. This is where the shift to Meta comes in. Most people interpret it as a risky pivot, a speculative move into uncertain territory. But if you look at Zuckerberg's pattern, it's consistent. He doesn't build products, he builds environments. Facebook was an environment for social interaction. The next step is expanding that environment into something more immersive, more controlled, more comprehensive. The concept of the metaverse is often misunderstood because people evaluate it through the lens of current technology. But Zuckerberg isn't optimizing for the present, he's positioning for the future. A space where interaction, identity, and experience are all contained within a system that can be designed, modified, and controlled at a foundational level. If that sounds ambitious, it's because it is. But it's also a natural progression of the same logic that built Facebook. Start with behavior. Build a system around it. Expand that system until it becomes essential. What makes this story powerful is not the scale of the outcome, but the consistency of the method. Zuckerberg didn't rely on luck, timing, or external validation. He relied on understanding how systems work, how they grow, how they sustain themselves, and how they maintain control under pressure. While others focused on creating value, he focused on creating dependency. While others reacted to change, he positioned himself to define it. And while most people see platforms as tools, he saw them as environments that shape behavior. That's why Facebook didn't just succeed. It endured. It adapted. It expanded beyond its original purpose without losing its core structure. And that leads to the final realization. This was never a story about social media. It was a story about control at scale. Not control in the obvious sense, but in the structural sense. The ability to influence how people connect, how they communicate, and ultimately, how they experience reality. Once you understand that, the rest of the story becomes clear. Zuckerberg didn't build a company that people use. He built a system that people operate within. And when a system reaches that level, it doesn't need to compete. It doesn't need to dominate aggressively. It simply continues to exist, because everything around it has already adapted to it. That's the real outcome. Not just success, not just influence, but integration into the structure of everyday life. And once something becomes part of that structure, removing it is no longer a simple decision. It becomes a disruption, and people avoid disruption. That's why the system holds. Not because it forces people to stay, but because it becomes easier than leaving. And that is a completely different kind of power. And this is what makes the story truly uncomfortable. Mark Zuckerberg didn't just create a platform used by billions of people. He built a system that those people live inside of, quietly, constantly, often without realizing it. And the real question isn't how big it became. It's how deeply it integrated itself into everyday life. Because size can be measured, influence can be debated, but integration is something people rarely notice. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply becomes normal. And once something becomes normal, it becomes invisible. That's where the real shift happens. Because real power isn't about forcing behavior. It's about shaping the environment where behavior happens. And in that environment, people don't feel controlled. They feel comfortable, connected, engaged. But underneath all of that, the system keeps running, collecting, adapting, expanding, not loudly, not aggressively, but consistently. That's what makes it durable, because systems like this don't rely on attention, they rely on habit. And habits are far more difficult to break than decisions. You can decide to stop using something, but breaking a habit requires awareness, and most people never reach that point, so they stay. Not because they're forced to, but because leaving feels unnecessary, or inconvenient, or simply unimportant.